Everyone's on the ball about show, don't tell, but nobody is actually talking about when you should tell. Look, I know show, don't tell is basically the golden rule of creative writing, and it's hammered into us the moment we start taking our writing seriously. And yeah, it's important, but it's incomplete advice. And if you're following it religiously without understanding the complete picture, then you might be making your story worse, not better. So in this video, we're gonna break down what show, don't tell means, how it's commonly misinterpreted, and most importantly, when you should actually be telling instead of showing. Once you understand the nuances of this advice, your writing will level up dramatically. If you're new here, my name is Brianna and I post videos every Sunday that help you become a better writer. I also make easy to use writing workbooks that help you build and outline your novel from start to finish, so if you're interested, check them out in my Etsy shop, Planner Palette Co., linked in the description below, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel. Let's start with the basics. What does show, don't tell even mean? The concept is attributed to Russian playwright Anton Chekhov, who famously said, "Don't tell me the moon is shining, show me the glint of light on broken glass." It's beautiful, and it makes sense. Showing means you're giving readers sensory details, action, and dialogue that allows them to experience the story firsthand. You're transmitting an experience rather than just stating it. Telling, on the other hand, is when you simply inform the reader of something directly. You're asserting facts for them to accept rather than them living through the moment. An example of telling would say, Sarah was terrified. An example of showing would say, Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the doorknob. Her breath came shallow, and she couldn't stop glancing over her shoulder at the shadows creeping across the hallway. The first example tells us Sarah's emotional state. The second shows us her physical reactions and allows us to infer that she's terrified. We get to experience her fear alongside her. And this is where the advice gets it right. Showing creates immersion. It makes readers feel like they're living in the scene, moment by moment. It's visceral, it's engaging. It's what separates creative writing from something like a textbook or a news article. But showing isn't always the right choice. The problem with show, don't tell is that it's treated like the absolute rule, like some kind of sacred commandment that should never ever be broken. So when writers follow it blindly, they wind up making some pretty significant mistakes. If there is to be an absolute rule that all writers must follow, it's that creative writing doesn't need to conform to all the rules all the time. And it's when you break or bend those rules in ways that people haven't seen before that you open up your writing to something new or inspired. So let's go over some issues I tend to see in writing that sticks to the show don't tell rule too strictly. I'll also give you some weak and strong examples. Now I'll caveat that these are not perfect examples, they're just meant to give you a better understanding of what I mean. So the first issue is overwriting and bloat. Showing takes up a lot more words than telling. If you show almost every single thing that happens in your story, your manuscript is going to be like 10,000 pages long. Let's say your character needs to travel from one city to another for an important meeting. If you're showing the entire journey, the packing, the drive to the hotel, checking in, the flight, the landing, the taxi ride to the hotel, you could easily burn through 20 pages of material that adds nothing to your plot. This kind of hyper-focusing is when you're so focused on showing every mundane moment that you lose sight of what actually matters to your story. Your pacing grinds to a halt, readers get bored, and ironically, all that sensory detail you work so hard on becomes filler and white noise. So let's look at a weak example of this. Marcus woke up to the sound of his alarm blaring. He reached over and hit the snooze button, then lay there for another 5 minutes before finally sitting up. He rubbed his eyes and yawned, then stood up, stretched his arms above his head, and shuffled to the bathroom. He turned on the shower, hearing his phone ding from an incoming notification, and waited as the steam began to fill the small bathroom. Then he stepped under the spray and let the hot water run over his shoulders. You see what's happening here? Nothing. Nothing is happening. We're getting a play-by-play of Marcus's morning routine, but none of it advances the story or reveals anything meaningful about his character. The only time this would work is if you're trying to lead up to the next scene, which is a complete contrast between the mundane moment that he's experiencing in the first scene. Like, for example, in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, when the story starts with Arthur's seemingly dull, boring life until it leads up to the fact that his house is about to be demolished, and then all of a sudden his friend, who he finds out is an alien, sweeps him off the planet before Earth gets destroyed. In a case like that, it makes sense. It's purposeful, it's intentional. What I'm saying in most cases is that this is not the case. This is not what they're trying to do. They're just showing all the details because they feel like they have to, even though it doesn't actually serve a purpose for the story. So a stronger example would be to cut out all of that and just say, Marcus overslept again. By the time he stumbled out the door, cursing to himself as he buttoned his shirt, he'd already missed a train and his boss's third call. See how much faster that moves? Yes, we're telling the reader what happened, but it gets us to the important part, that Marcus is late and he's in trouble, without wasting pages on bathroom rituals that the reader doesn't need to know about because it doesn't serve any purpose to the story. The second issue is losing the reader in minutia. Now this falls under the same umbrella as overwriting and bloat, and it's when the writers get so caught up in showing details that they forget about clarity and narrative flow. Sometimes you need to just tell the reader something so they can understand what's going on, so you can progress. If you bury every piece of information in layers of subtext and sensory description, your readers might get confused or frustrated, and they're more likely going to end up skimming over those sections of information and missing out on things they need to know. This is especially true for world building in fantasy or sci-fi. If you're introducing a complex magic system or a new technology, you can't always show how it works through action alone. Sometimes you need to pause and explain it directly so that your readers can follow along. A weak example of this might be Anna touched the crystal and suddenly her vision doubled. She saw through her own eyes and through someone else's eyes at the same time. The room tilted, colors bled into each other. She felt a pull like something was trying to drag her consciousness somewhere else, but she held on, focusing on the hum of the crystal against her palm until the sensation faded. Okay, so this scene is pure sensory overload, and we have no idea what magic is happening here or why it matters. Now you might think that, yeah, I can follow along. She accidentally touched this crystal and now something strange is happening to her. I'll just keep reading and all will be explained later on. You'd be right if Anna wasn't expecting this to happen or if she was new to this magic. But what if I told you that in this scene, Anna is actually a master of this magic and the reader already knows that she's a master of it? Now it's confusing because the writer makes it seem like she's experiencing something new, not something familiar. And we still don't know what this magic is. If Anna is familiar with this magic, then we as a reader should get that feeling of familiarity as well, even if we don't know about it ourselves. So, knowing this context, a stronger example might be Anna touched the crystal and her vision fell away to 1,000 colors. Instantly, she honed in on the comforting hum that connected her to the other creature's soul. Though it was a lost and forbidden magic, soul binding was one of the few things that brought her peace. The warmth of the glass against her fingertips, the subtle vibrations across her temples. Most of all, it was that her mind could finally organize itself into one coherent side of her head as the other one was pulled inside. Each binding held the risk of merging both souls together, but Anna wasn't afraid. At last, the connection stabilized. Complete, she opened her mind to whatever consciousness awaited. Now we know what's happening. We're told what the magic is called, what it does, and the risk, and we're also shown that familiarity she feels and why she enjoys it. And that's because it's being told to us in a way that makes us feel like this isn't something new, this is something normal and common for this character. So that is an example of when to tell certain pieces of information and when to show the feelings and emotions and experiences of what's happening to her. The third issue is pacing. Here's the thing about pacing. It's not about going fast all the time. It's about controlling the speed and rhythm of your story to match the content. And one of the best tools for controlling pacing is knowing when to show and when to tell. Scenes that are critical to your plot, character development, or emotional impact, show those. Play them out in real time with all the sensory detail and dialogue that they deserve. But transitions, backstories, and other less important events, tell those. Summarize them. Move through them quickly so that you can get back to the good stuff. Because if you're showing everything with equal weight, your story will feel monotonous. You won't get those highs and lows anymore. And so readers won't know what's important anymore because everything is treated like the climax of the novel. So a weak example of this is a long one. Elena spent the next 3 weeks training with Torin. On the first day, she woke before dawn and made her way to the courtyard where Torin waited, his arms crossed, expression stern. The stones were cold beneath her bare feet as they went through the forms over and over. Again, he'd say, and by evening she could barely lift her sword. The second day was worse. Every muscle screamed in protest when she dragged herself out of bed, but she went to the courtyard anyway. Again, Torin made her run through the forms. By midday, she collapsed onto the bench, gasping for air, while Torin watched her with those unreadable eyes. Then in the afternoon, they sparred. By the third day, Elena started to wonder if she'd ever get stronger. The courtyard stones felt colder, Torin's silence felt heavier, still she kept showing up, kept pushing through the pain, kept trying to meet his impossible standards. Torin's expression never changed, just that same stony disappointment. Day 4 brought rain and thunder, but Torin didn't care. They trained in the downpour, even when she slipped on wet stone and scraped up her legs. The second week held a glimmer of hope when her sword finally clashed against Torin's and his brow lifted in surprise. This could go on for pages. We're showing every single training session in exhaustive detail, but unless something significant happens during this training montage, we don't need to live through every moment of it. A stronger example of this might be Elena spent 3 brutal weeks training with Torin. Every morning, whether in scorching heat or pelting rain, she woke before dawn and made her way barefoot to the courtyard. Torin would be waiting, his arms crossed, expression stern. Again, he'd say, and she'd go through the forms one more time. By midday, she'd collapse onto the bench, gasping for air, while Torin watched her with those unreadable eyes. Then, in the afternoons, they'd spar. Every night, she would rest her battered body, wishing but refusing to quit. By the last final days, she could hold her own in a sparring match, and Torin had stopped calling her hopeless, which, coming from him, was practically a compliment. In this one paragraph, you're told the passage of time and the growth of her character through the trials of training without minimizing the impact it had on her. You get a solid understanding of her fortitude and her growing strength, and now we can move on to the present time after the training has finished. Now, if you want to highlight how much Elena struggles in the beginning of the training, you can absolutely include a scene that shows just how weak she is, and how Torin tears her a new one about how incapable she is. But stop there, at that one scene. Make it a memorable moment that gives readers a sense of what exactly she's in for with this training, and then move on to the next paragraph, like the strong example I just read, to tell the passage of time and how she's grown by the end. In this way, the story keeps flowing without the unnecessary filler. So, if showing isn't always the answer, when should you actually tell? When you need to control pacing? As I mentioned before, telling is your best friend when it comes to pacing. Use it to summarize less important events, transitions, or passages of time. If your character travels from point A to point B and nothing interesting happens on the way, just tell us that they arrived. If a week passes where your character is doing routine tasks, summarize it in a sentence or two. Save the showing for scenes that matter, when the information is complex. So if you're explaining a complicated magic system, a historical event, or a piece of technology, sometimes the clearest approach is to just tell the reader exactly what they need to know. Yes, you can weave in some showing, like the characters interacting with the magic or technology, but don't be afraid to pause and give a straightforward explanation when it's necessary for comprehension. And 3, when you want to create distance. Sometimes telling creates a deliberate emotional distance that serves your story. For example, if you're writing a traumatic event from a character's point of view, but that character is disassociating or emotionally numb, telling can reflect their mental state better than showing every visceral detail. So an example of that would be, she didn't remember much after that. The ambulance, maybe. Flashing lights, someone asking her questions she couldn't answer. It all felt far away, like it was happening to someone else. This tells us what happens without showing it in detail, which mirrors the character's detached mental state. In fact, showing the scene in vivid sensory detail might actually undermine the emotional impact. And 4, when showing would be redundant. If you've already established something through showing, you don't need to keep showing it over and over again. Let's say you spent a scene showing how deeply insecure a character is about their appearance. You've given us their internal monologue, their body language, their avoidance of mirrors. Great, you've shown it. Now later in the story, you can just tell us her insecurity flared up again, or something like that, without needing to replay the same internal spiral. Your readers already know what that looks like, so trust them to remember, and if you want to really reinforce the emotional impact of that again later on in the scene, do it sparingly and with purpose, where the reader knows that maybe something is different about this internal spiral this time, or it highlights some kind of character development that's happening within them. Show don't tell isn't bad advice, it's just incomplete. The real rule should be show what matters, tell the rest. Show the moments that are crucial to the story, the emotional turning points, the character development, the high-stakes action, the meaningful interactions. These are the scenes where the readers need to be fully immersed, experiencing every detail alongside your characters. But tell the connective tissue, the transitions, the backstory, the exposition, the less important events. This keeps your story moving, prevents bloat, and ensures that when you do show something, it has maximum impact because it stands out from the rest. So how do you find the right balance? First, read your work out loud. If you find yourself getting bored during a scene, that might be a sign that you're overwriting. Ask yourself, does this need to be shown or can I summarize it? Second, look at your pacing. Are there sections where the story drags, where you're stuck in description or action without the plot moving forward? Or worse, do you find yourself skimming certain sections? Those can be prime candidates for telling instead of showing. And third, pay attention to what your readers are saying, whether they're beta readers, family, or friends, whoever is reading your draft. If they're confused about something, you might need more telling to clarify. If they're skimming sections, you might either need more showing to engage them or less showing to tighten the pace. That's on you to figure out. And finally, study the authors that you admire. Look at how they balance showing and telling. You'll notice that even the most immersive sensory writers use summary and exposition in strategic ways. Now, I'm not saying that show don't tell is useless advice. It's not. Showing is powerful. It's how you create immersion, emotion, and connection with your readers. But it's not the be-all and end-all of good writing. If you're treating it like an unbreakable rule, you're limiting yourself and you're tying one hand behind your back. Trust your readers, trust your story, and most importantly, trust yourself to know what your book needs. Because at the end of the day, the goal isn't to follow every piece of writing advice perfectly. The goal is to tell a great story, and sometimes that means telling, not showing. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, you might want to watch this one next. And drop a comment if you've ever found yourself overwriting because you felt like you need to be showing everything. Until the next chapter.